Hey everybody, welcome back. It is, I don't know, April 23rd, 2nd, 3rd? Gotta be the 3rd. April 23rd. And today, or actually not today, but in this episode, we are working on a Wico Model C Magneto for 2-cylinder John Deere tractors. And this is a short lug magneto, so the degree of angle that the impulse needs to be set to, or the lag angle of the impulse, is a little bit different than a long lug, so we'll cover that when we get to it in the video. But just another magneto video. This one was by request. You know, I've had people ask about international mags, I've had people ask about Fairbanks Morse mags, I've had, you know, Wico mags, and finally getting around to the Wico. So hope you guys enjoy, and let's jump into it. All right, here we go. Here's our Wico C in its original condition. We'll go ahead and remove the distributor cap from the back. Just 2 screws that holds it on. And underneath there we will find the rotor and the points and the condenser. Pull the rotor off. And we can start disassembling the wires that are connected to the junction block, which are 1 wire from the coil and 1 wire from the condenser. And then the points connect there as well. I'm just removing the screw that holds the articulating point set in place, or movable points, if you will. Pulling the wires up out of the way. Remove the condenser, just held in by 2 screws. These magnetos are quite simple. There's a few nuances in them, but for the most part they're pretty simple. So I've got the condenser out. Go ahead and pull the cap off the back side. It's 4 screws that hold the cap on. One of the more difficult parts of these magnetos is the impulse, which you'll see later on in the video. You have to wind the impulse spring in these. Some magnetos require winding, some don't. The Wicos do require winding of the impulse spring, similar to the F4 international magnetos, but the F4s are a little bit easier to wind the spring in. So remove the cover. We can see the back of the coil and then the magnets and the rotating assembly there. So right now I'm just removing the 2 brackets that hold the coil in place. They're just kind of like a little S or J bracket, if you will. Not much to it, really. Like I said, the front side is the more challenging part of it. So take the coil out, and then the coil bar will slide out of the coil. Sometimes you have to press them out if they're kind of rusted in place, but this one isn't too bad. So, all right, flip it over, and we've got the impulse assembly. We can remove the nut. And once again, that spring is under tension, so be careful when you pull it apart. This one doesn't look to be in too bad a shape, so we'll remove the spring from the impulse cup. Out of the frame of the camera there, but it's a little rusty, but we'll soak it in some lacquer thinner to remove the excess grease and oil that are on it. On the front, there's two discs that go in the center of the spring, and there's a spacer behind those discs. It's a real thin washer. Right now, I'm just giving the front of the rotating assembly some taps with a rubber mallet so that I can get those thick washers off, or the thick discs. And this one was actually missing the small shim or spacer, and then behind that is a larger plate that goes on top of the impulse dogs. So now we can drive that rotating assembly out. There's also a thicker spacer here. It's like a collar that goes to space out the center of that plate that goes over the front of the impulse. So sometimes these can be quite difficult to get out. A few taps with a rubber mallet to get it out of the impulse plate itself, and then it just pulls out of the bushing. So this magnet assembly isn't in too bad a shape. I'm inspecting the shaft because where that impulse plate rides, it can sometimes put some pretty significant wear in the shaft as well as in the center of that impulse plate. So that's something to pay close attention to. From there, we can remove the plate that adjusts the timing of the magneto, or the lag angle, I should say. Now these are set to a 25-degree lag angle on the short lug magnetos. Long lug magnetos are 35 degrees. But this plate is just held in by 4 screws, and then in the center is a seal that has a collar that goes through the middle of it. It's like a leather seal that goes in the middle. And you have to be pretty careful with that when you're cleaning these up. So be mindful of that. If you use a wire wheel or something to clean all these parts up, you have to be careful. I blast them, but I put my fingers tightly over that seal so that I don't damage the seal itself. And that quick clip was just me showing the collar there that was in the center of it. Removing the oil slinger. That plate was an oil slinger. And then the felt that goes down behind it. This one's still nice and soft and flexible, so we'll reuse it. Then there's a little spring-loaded plate that goes behind that. There's a small spring and scraper that goes into that hole for the oil slinger. There's also a gasket behind that plate that adjusts the lag angle. So I'm removing that with a razor blade. These can be quite stubborn. Sometimes a little heat on that gasket helps to free it from the metal, but I usually just use an X-Acto knife and don't have much trouble getting it out of there with an X-Acto knife. So there we go. The housing is stripped. Take it over to the blast cabinet and get it cleaned up. All right, all cleaned up and ready for reassembly. I've got the magnetic rotor polished up and cleaned up. Put a little oil on the journal that slides down in the bushing. Magnet's also been recharged. So once we get that slid down into place, we rotate it around to distribute the oil in the bushing. That way it's got a good coating. Check rotation of it. And then I mount it up in the vise, because when we put the impulse and everything together, it's a lot easier to have it in a vise so the magneto is stationary. Insert that little spring-loaded plate for the felt. Reinstall the felt, and then I take some oil and redistribute the oil onto that felt. That way you're not running it dry right away. And we can insert that small spring with the scraper on it. Oh, putting the gasket in place first, but there's no, you can do that after you insert that spring with the scraper on it. Again, that's just a little scraper to help remove excess oil on that oil slinger. Put the oil slinger in place. And then we can put that impulse lag angle adjustment plate in place. Now there are a series of marks both on the magneto body, and then there's one mark on the impulse lag angle adjustment plate. So I'm just going to loosely install the screws here, so when we do set the lag angle, which is again is 25 degrees, we can quickly just tighten them down so we don't lose that setting. So the position that is straight up is a 13-degree angle, and each mark on the magneto body is 5 degrees. So if we want to go 25 degrees, we would move between the, what is it, second and third mark. If you start at 13, then you go to 18, then 23, then the next one will be 28. So you want to be between 23 and 28. The good news is I don't stab my hand in this video, so that's a plus. Get everything snug down. Then we can install our impulse plate itself. And I always drive it down with a little bit of, I have this little tool that we use to kind of drive it down into place and set it. That spacer goes in there. A little bit of oil on the pins for the impulse dogs. And then the challenging part. After we put this plate on, we have that thin spacer washer that I mentioned that was missing in this magneto. Now we have to assemble the spring in the impulse, which this is a challenge. We have a special tool that we use that Rudy made to help wind the spring into this. So this is our special tool that we use to wind it. Now this is just to install the spring into the cup. So it can be quite the challenge. If anybody's ever wound a spring for a recoil on a small gas engine, that's no fun either. So this really isn't too bad. Once you get it started, it usually goes pretty smoothly. I'm just tapping it down into place to ensure that it's all seated properly. A little grease on the spring just to help lubricate everything as it winds. And then you have to, what I like to do is just put a little bit of a bend in the center part of the spring to help hold those two discs in place, because it's pretty difficult to get those things to stay in there without putting a little bit of bend on that spring so there's tension on those discs. So we insert the discs into the spring, and then very carefully we slide the impulse down onto the shaft for the magnetic rotor. We have to wind it very carefully, and you'll see here that it's a fight sometimes. Sometimes the springs don't want to cooperate, and I end up turning the camera off here because it continued to fight me. So I actually I had to rewind the spring, I bet you about 4 or 5 times, but eventually I got it. So now we're wound. We're installing the front nut, and then I always put Loctite on this nut. Spin it back and forth a few times just to help distribute that Loctite and get it down in place. Now again, that impulse spring has to be wound. It's usually 1/2 a turn or 1 full turn, depending on the spring, um, past the initial installation point. It's very important that you put that spring under tension. So here's our coil and coil bar going into the back side of the magneto. Try to make sure that that coil bar is centered as best you can. And we can go ahead and put the clips in that hold the coil in place. Now, the one grounding wire that's on this coil, I bend the eyelet at a 90-degree angle so that it's easier to install the cover. It's kind of tight quarters underneath there, so you need as much space as you can get. And that screw can be a challenge, just working with the wire in the ring terminal that's on the end of it. So putting the other clip in place for that coil. All right, so from there, whoop, forgot the gasket. Hold on a minute. Put the gasket on. Make sure it's seated all the way around. Then we can install the cap on the rear. Don't forget to bend the contacts in place. Go ahead and tighten all the screws down. And then from there, we can install the final components, which would be the condenser, the points, and then join the wires at the junction block with the points. And ultimately leading to the rotor, the rear gasket, and the distributor cap. So we'll go ahead and install the condenser. It's just the two screws that hold the condenser in place. And these little adjustable blade screwdrivers to hold the screws on the end are really a handy little tool when you're working in these tight areas with small screws. So now we can install the adjustable point set. Sometimes you have to turn that adjustment screw back and forth to get them to seat. Then there's a spacer that goes above it and a sleeve that goes over the center shaft. We can install the stationary contacts, or the ones that ride on the cam of the magnetic rotor. And these points are set to 15 thousandths. Sometimes it's hard to work underneath the camera like that. You know, with a chest mounted camera, sometimes it's right in the way of where your eyes need to see. So, but I try to keep it in view of the camera when I'm working on that stuff. So again, we'll check the gap. They should be 15 thousandths. This one needs to be adjusted a little bit. We always adjust the points while they're at the high point on the cam lobe. A little too much, I think. We'll open them back up a hair. That's about right. Go ahead and lock them in. Double check them to make sure. And then this part here can be a little challenging. You're putting the two wires together, and you have to make sure that you allow plenty of space for the screws on the distributor cover, or distributor cap rather. And then at the same time, that mounting point for the points has to be, it's spring loaded, it's under tension with the spring, and it has to be moved over to line the hole up in that junction block. So it can be kind of a challenge to get it all lined up, but once it's in, typically don't have a problem. So oh, jumped out on me. So once we get everything tightened down, pretty simple at this point. It's just installing the rotor and gasket and distributor cover. Just trying to get the wires situated so that they don't interfere with the screws for the distributor cap. Not much area to work with inside there, so you have to make sure that nothing's in the way. All right, install the rotor, install the gasket, and the distributor cap. Now you do have to be careful with these. I always rotate them over by hand to make sure there's no binding anywhere. I do that with any magneto, but particularly on these Wico Cs, we have had issues with the rotor hitting the contacts in the cap. So sometimes you have to loosen things up and adjust them around in order to get the proper clearances underneath there. So what I'm doing now, just making sure that there's no issues with the rotation of the mag. Hook it up on the test bench, run it through by hand to make sure the impulse is operating correctly. Oh, and my dog is drinking water again. So go ahead and fire it up, see what happens. Plenty of spark, a good hot mag. Well, there it is, folks, a Wico C short lug. All right, so there you have it. There's the process of the rebuild of the Wico C Magneto. And if many of you are wondering, no, I'm not going to be going to Le Sueur, the swap meet. Unfortunately, the weather was questionable today, and I didn't want to take my daughter with me to essentially a mud fest and to brave severe storms. Yeah, we're actually getting thunderstorms in April. Imagine that. We went from snow a couple days ago to now thunderstorms today, and then the temperature's going to drop back out in the next couple days here. But anyways, that's all I've got. So hope you guys enjoyed. Stay tuned, and thanks for watching and wrenching with me. So take care, guys.